Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. My guest co-host is Graham Markowitz, the Executive Director of the Security and Defense Forum. Today's guest is Ryan Haas, the Director of the John L. Thornton China Center and Taiwan Studies Chair at the Brookings Institution, a leading analyst of U.S. China relations with expertise at the National Security Council, advising President Obama. On a day when President Trump publicly laments losing India and Russia to deeper ties with China after the major summit, and as new U.S. visa restrictions target Central Americans linked to Chinese Communist Party's activities. We're excited to hear Ryan's insights on the fast-changing landscape of global strategic competition. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
You are an expert on China. So what is the current trajectory of U.S.-China relations, and what key factors are shaping it today?
Well, I think one of the things that Washington and Beijing both agree upon is that the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship is heading downward. And it has been for some time. This is not a new development or a news flash. Where they differ is on the diagnosis of the problem. I think from Beijing's perspective, they view the United States as acting like an anxious declining power, seeking to cling to its privileged position and pushing China down in the process. And from Washington's perspective, I think that the view is much more that China is acting aggressively abroad and repressively at home. And with the Trump administration, I think there's an added layer to this, which is I think President Trump's diagnosis is that China has been ripping off the United States for a long time, and it's necessary and overdue for the United States to sort of level the playing field. And so both of these parties are coming at the problems in the relationship from a very different vantage. And depending upon which vantage you choose, it leads you in different policy directions. So from China's perspective, they don't expect the United States and China to reach some harmonious partnership anytime soon. They think the United States is going to be very determined to try to slow its rise. And so from their perspective, the solution to that problem is to amass power and influence to a level at which the United States has no alternative other than to accommodate and accept China as a major leading central global power. And I think from the American perspective, the approach is just different. It's that the United States under President Trump is going to use a combination of personal charm, but also find sources of leverage to try to chip away at some of the imbalances and unfairness in the relationship. The challenge that I see going forward for the relationship is that President Xi and President Trump potentially are just arriving at different places. President Trump believes that he is going to be entering into a negotiation with the Chinese to address some of these problems in the relationship and revise the terms of the relationship. My sense from being in Beijing recently and talking with other Chinese counterparts is that they just simply do not trust or wish to showcase a partnership between the United States and China. And so that's sort of the structural tension at the heart of the relationship, and I think one of the obstacles that we'll face going forward.
Before we dive into where the relationship is now, I think it'd be helpful to get an understanding of how we got here. President Obama famously tried to do a pivot to Asia. Did we pivot, and did it work?
I think the pivot is ongoing. It's had fits and starts. I think that there has been a consistent through line of interest and ambition to pivot from Obama all the way through first Trump, through Biden, and now. There are members within the Trump administration today that are very committed to the idea of pivoting resources and focus to Asia. The challenge is that the world's a messy place. We have a situation in the Middle East, situation in Ukraine. Previously, there was obviously the challenges in the Middle East and Afghanistan that just chewed up bandwidth and resources that have not allowed the United States to operate along the trajectory that it wishes it could. And so I think that this will be sort of a generational undertaking. I don't think that there will be a finish line at which the United States will have put an exclamation point on its pivot. But as I look to the future, and sort of examine which regions of the world are going to have the most outsized impact upon the United States in our lifetimes, I think that most people would come to accept that Asia answers that question. And so out of that sort of strategic imperative and sort of recognition of our own national interest, I think that we will naturally continue to do so, though perhaps not at the speed that many of us would like.
maybe we could zoom out just a little bit further and look at China domestically and where their situation is. I'm hearing a lot of people argue that China's governance model is becoming less flexible. Their population has peaked and its workforce is shrinking. Even that, the economic rebound in China has been weaker than expected after COVID. So what are you seeing domestically in China, and how does that shape the U.S. response? Maybe is strategic patience a viable alternative to sort of this containment or decoupling?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in my mind at least, and I welcome you to challenges, I think that the only way to understand China is by being able to hold different sort of thoughts in tension at the same time, right? Because you can tell two stories at the same time. The first story that you can tell is one of, demographic decline, economic slowdown, state-owned enterprises sort of eating up the capital needed to go to the private sector, a slumping property market, which accounts for close to a quarter of China's economy. There are, by any objective standard, a lot of really bad problems on the balance sheet of China, and at the same time, they are absolutely ripping in many of the leading edge technologies of the future, and whether it's solar, batteries, clean energy, drones, nuclear, some of the military hardware that is being developed and was on display recently in China's military parade, electric vehicles, AI. China's leading companies are doing extraordinarily well. And so I think that both things are happening simultaneously. I would say that 50% of the Chinese economy is pretty bad. 5 to 10% of it is extraordinarily strong, globally strong. And those two things happen alongside each other. And then on the political front, Graham, my view is that China's model has never been one that I have seen value in emulating. It's a pretty idiosyncratic Leninist top-down model. And when you have a strong leader who has a vision and is able to sort of marshal resources in the direction of a strategic goal, China can move with alacrity and speed. But when China sort of moves off track, it sometimes has difficulty correcting course. And that's where I think the United States has a bit of an advantage. We make mistakes daily as a country. We're off track fairly often, but we tend to have a pretty good record, at least over the past 70 to 100 years, of correcting course when we get off track too far. And so we have a little bit more adaptability in our system and a little more flexibility that I think allows us to avoid some of the potholes that Beijing occasionally runs into.
I think a lot of developing countries around the world, if they had to pick, would pick the Chinese model. You say we're often off track. It seems like in the last 10 years, we've been more off track than on track. The bungling of the pandemic, the Afghanistan withdrawal 4 years ago, which was not great, seeming weak to invite Russia into Ukraine, basically. It seems as if the Biden administration kind of dropped the ball in the region and dropped the ball with China by not having a clear approach, not having a clear foreign policy, and then showing weakness, which allowed China to deepen its mission to tie in developing countries. Is that wrong?
Well, thank you for the question. I maybe come at it slightly differently from the way that you framed it, but it's a useful sort of provocation. My own view of this is that the Biden administration got a lot of things right and a few things they came up short on. But let me just start out by accepting the premise of your point, which is that developing countries see a lot of value in having close and closening relations with China. I think that we should all acknowledge and accept that. In the Biden administration's record, I would say a few things. First, on what they got right. I think if you look at where they ended compared to where they began, America's alliance relationships in Asia and abroad were stronger than they were when they arrived in office. The gap in economic size of the United States compared to China was wider when the Biden administration left office than when it entered. In other words, America's economy grew faster than China's economy during the 4 years that the Biden administration was in office. They climbed out of a pretty deep COVID hole and sort of served as an arsenal of vaccines for many parts of the world. and delivered a need to people in the region that China couldn't match. So I think that they deserve, credit for that as well. And I think that the convening power of the United States around global challenges was strengthened during the 4 years that the Biden administration was in office. But would I give the Biden administration an A+ in its approach to China? No. And I've written publicly and spoken publicly about this. But I think that one of the challenges is that the Biden administration never developed a narrative to explain what it was that the United States was trying to do with China. What was the purpose, the animating goal, the direction? How would we measure success? How do we know if we're on the right track? What are the benchmarks that we would use? Reviewing the 4 years of the Biden administration, you would have difficulty finding any evidence to sort of fill in that space. The other challenge I thought was that the Biden administration really prioritized politics over policy. And when you do that, you end up sort of whipsawing with public opinion and biasing towards always trying to project toughness and strength, because that's what I think many people perceive to be popular. Americans like to be reminded of our strength on the world stage. But sometimes wise strategy requires doing things that aren't popular in the immediate term. And so I think that sometimes that led them astray. And, to your final point, I don't necessarily fault the Biden administration for the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. I wish that would never have happened. And maybe you can make a counterfactual argument that if the United States under Biden had been stronger and tougher, that Putin would have been deterred. But they were dealt a pretty tough hand with October 7th, with the invasion in Ukraine. And as we were discussing a moment ago, I think that took some of the wind out of the air of our efforts to reprioritize and focus more on Asia and China specifically.
So I'd love to follow up on that and kind of where that brings us to today. We're seeing the current administration signal a pullback from multilateral institutions, global development programs, and these other sort of soft power platforms. And China appears to be filling in the gaps through BRICS, Belt and Road, expanding media and education influence. So is it kind of as simple as there's a zero sum here, and as the U.S. pulls back, China's filling in that gap? And what else does China have to gain as we're kind of leaving them to reshape the international order?
Well, I do certainly feel like America's retrenchment or retreat from global leadership is creating a vacuum. And I think that China is doing a fairly good job of filling parts of that vacuum. I'm not sure that it is we're at a terminal stage where everything is final and it's going to be frozen in time from this point forward. So I remain optimistic that there is capacity for course correction in the United States going forward. But if we took a snapshot of today and looked at the world, I think that it would be hard to challenge the notion that China is gaining ground and influence and an ability to impose its will in parts of the world that the United States values and sees as strategically significant. My own view is that America has sort of three big strengths that we control and that China does not. One is our domestic dynamism, our ability to attract the very best and brightest people and the biggest, boldest ideas, these world-changing industries that get incubated in the United States. We control that. China does not. The second is our alliance network. I am still of the view that our alliances are a force multiplier of American strength and influence on the world stage, and that we sort of let them perish at our own peril. And then the third is our ability to sort of bring the world together, or bring a mass of countries with capacity together to tackle big, hard global challenges that no one country can tackle on its own. That's something that traditionally the United States has been uniquely good at doing when we have sort of focused our mind on it. And unfortunately, I see us sort of atrophying on all three of those areas of sort of foundational strength of the United States in the current moment. And, I remain hopeful that we will regain our footing going forward. But the current picture is, I think you were alluding to, Graham, is one that is troubling.
What is China's end game for the century?
It's a great question. It's a question that people are actively, energetically debating. So I will share my perspective acknowledging that it is not the settled view of the China watching community. My view is that China wants to be acknowledged and respected as a central leading global power on the world stage. It does not want to be trifled with. It wants others to respect its interpretation of its territorial integrity and sovereignty, which includes, from Beijing's perspective, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet. They want their political system to be respected, their economic model to be acknowledged as a leading economic model, and I think that they want to benefit from the shadow of the future. And I think that they believe that that the more that they move towards those goals, the more prestige the China will enjoy, and the more sort of authority within China the Chinese Communist Party will have. And so, there are a range of views. Some people think that the only goal of the Chinese leadership is to preserve the power of the Chinese Communist Party. That's one end of the spectrum. Others at the far end of the spectrum believe that the goal is to sort of topple the United States, displace the United States, and impose their vision and values upon the world, and we will all live within a Chinese world. I guess I fall somewhere in the middle of those two poles by saying that China wants to be acknowledged and accepted as a global power that has to be consulted on every major global issue that comes to the fore.
So, how do we need to deal with China moving forward? It's clear what others' approach is in dealing with China. We saw, for example, President Putin walking with Xi a couple of days ago. What should the U.S. approach be in dealing with China moving forward?
It's a great question. I start from the premise that we will have tremendous difficulty remolding China into our preferred image. We've tried and failed in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya. We've spent decades trying to work on Cuba, a small, relatively weak island 90 miles off the shores of Florida, and still have not made progress. That should allow us to accept that our ability to sort of mold a country of 1.4 billion people that comprises 1 out of every 5 human beings on Earth, a robust power with a proud tradition of having a leadership role in the world, we're going to have limits in our ability to bend China to our will. And where that leads me, Nathan, I think, is that the most impactful thing we can do is to focus on ourselves, to be the best version of ourselves. If we're capable of doing that, if we sort of live to our values and rise to our potential, if we demonstrate that we are better able to deliver for our own people, we're better able to coordinate among countries to tackle global challenges that no other country can resolve on its own, I think we'll be just fine. Because ultimately, my view is that the role of government is to provide for the safety, the security, the prosperity, and the health of its people. And so I don't think that we necessarily need to crush China. I don't think that we have the capacity to contain China. I think that we need to focus much more on taking care of our own business, doing things well, living up to our values. If we do that, I think we'll do great.
Earlier on in the episode, we were talking about AI and their advancements in it. Obviously, a lot of what is developed for this technology is in Taiwan. Do you think that is going to lead to a conflict in the near future?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, let's just state the facts at the outset here. 90+% of the world's leading semiconductor chips are produced in Taiwan. And even though Taiwan companies are beginning to build fabs, fabrication plants in Germany, Japan, and outside of Phoenix, that isn't going to change the underlying dynamic, which is that a significant preponderance of the world's leading chips upon which the global economy depends are going to be produced and exported from Taiwan. And so I think that regardless of how you feel about Taiwan as a democratic partner or anything else, just the simple math of Taiwan's centrality to the global economy and the American economy means that the United States will remain heavily invested in Taiwan's safety and security for the foreseeable future.
But could there be a war?
Could there be? Yes. Is it possible? Absolutely. There is a non 0% chance that there is a war.
Could we win that war? And what would that war look like?
I'm not sure what winning would look like. There's never been a precedent of two nuclear armed powers with the types of long range strike, space, cyber, and other capabilities that the United States and China possess in fighting against each other in the history of humanity. And so the other, challenge that I see is that these are two very proud nations. The idea of one side getting punched in the nose and deciding, you know what, that hurt, I'm going to surrender. That's just not an available option. And I think that we should dispense with, with such fantastical thinking. If we ever found the United States and China in a kinetic conflict with each other, I think it would be extraordinarily tough for the two leaders to stop it. And I think that, it could potentially be a humanity extinction level type of event. So I think that we should invest tremendous effort in trying to avoid that outcome. But part of that is by ensuring that the United States military remains strong, so that China is not tempted to create conditions that could, whether by design or default, bring the United States and China into direct conflict with each other.
I would love to get Graham here in a minute, but I have a quick follow-up. At the start, before we were recording, we were talking about our sort of theory that in 100 years, people will look to the conflicts in Gaza, Israel, and in Ukraine as sort of important, but not to the 21st century. With that sort of focus, is it possible that the U.S. is overextended and focusing on things that, in a very simplistic way, will not matter in the end? And while China is keeping its powder dry, are we hurting our ability to counter China by being overextended right now?
I think that you could make an argument along those lines. But I think that we should also keep things in perspective. The United States does not have boots on the ground in Ukraine. We are not, losing soldiers in the Middle East at the moment. But are we depleting vital stockpiles by supporting these conflicts? Yes. Yes, I think that just as a statement of fact, that is true. Should it, energize the United States to work more closely with allies and partners around the world to replenish those stockpiles and to build capacity, redundancy, and also, resilience? I hope so. But that's going to be a project for the future.
I want to follow up on your points about Taiwan and chips and the fabs. I feel like I have to ask about this new NVIDIA deal involving the H20 chips. I'm not totally read in on the details, but it does seem pretty clearly this pay to play, right? This profit sharing with the federal government. So kind of pitting, undermining national security versus other people saying, well, it's the pragmatic approach. So how do you assess the sort of broader strategic implications? And where do you see these kinds of deals moving forward? Is this the first of many, or is this an outlier?
Well, I think that this was a sort of a proof of concept test. It's very novel for the United States to require extraction and bounty for the export of a product. I don't think any administration prior to this would have the imagination to sort of go in that direction. The Trump administration is very unique in this way. It was notable, though, that when NVIDIA had its quarterly earnings report, they reported zero sales to China of H20 chips and zero bookings for future sales of H20 chips to China. And so I think that we need to keep that in mind as well. There's this notion in Washington, at least, that China is just clamoring for H20 chips and just has an insatiable thirst to purchase them. I'm sure there are companies in China that would see tremendous value in having access to H20 chips, but it's not something that aligns with the political winds in Beijing at the moment, which is focused on self-reliance, self-strengthening, and hardening against dependence upon outside actors. And so I'm not sure. It'll take time to figure out sort of how this all nets out, but if folks in the Trump administration thought that the decision would be greeted by loud cheers and big hugs from Beijing, I think that they will be disappointed.
I'd love to focus in on kind of the work you're doing now at Brookings, the China Center, and the current research. Can you talk a little bit about your initiatives and its relevance to policymakers?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do is to figure out where there's space to contribute new ideas, fresh thinking. I mean, because the role of a think tank in the United States is not to be a validator of existing policy or a cheerleader of the current direction. It's to try to incubate new ideas for the future. And when think tanks work their best, they're able to see things that policymakers in the heat of the moment, having to deal with the day-to-day inbox of global challenges, just don't have the bandwidth to think about. And so the iconic example would be the Marshall Plan, which is a plan that was developed at Brookings, where I work, and something that we're very proud of 7 decades later. We don't have a Marshall Plan on the shelf right now, so that's a work in progress. But it's in that vein. As we look to the horizon, what are we missing? Where are opportunities that are being unrealized? Where are there risks that should be given greater consideration and weight? And what capacities would be needed to best mitigate or manage those risks and challenges? And so that's where our value is. The challenge that I feel every day, and I'll be curious to hear your impressions, Graham, from your work in think tank work, is there's a pull towards the present. Everyone wants to talk about what happened today, what it means, what will it tell us, where are we going, which is sort of zero sum. The more that you focus on the present, the less capacity you have to look to the horizon. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to try to find that balance point between being able to offer interpretations and analysis of what's happening, being able to provide our best advice to leaders in the United States and around the world about how to deal with issues, while at the same time preserving that capacity and that space to think boldly and broadly about the future and how best to navigate it.
Look, in closing, I just want to do a quick summary. The Biden administration did okay, but if you had to go at it again, I mean, you covered this on the National Security Council. Knowing what you know now, you're sitting there on January 20th, 2021. What would you have done differently?
Well, I made a conscious decision not to sit there on January 20th, 2021. But if we had a chance to rewind the tape and I made a different life decision, I guess what I would have done differently is to recognize the power of narrative.
Okay.
That if you think back to when America was at its best, when it performed its strongest, there was a sense of national purpose and direction. There was an understanding of what it was that the United States was seeking to achieve and what role people had in contributing, each in their own way, to that national success. And I feel like, from a technocratic perspective, I think the Biden administration made a lot of right decisions. I think they got a lot of things right, as we were talking about on alliances and the economy and other things. But they never built that narrative arc about what it is that the United States aspires to do and to accomplish, and how it expects to relate to China in that journey. And it's not entirely a critique of the friends, the men and women who served in the Biden administration. I think a large part of it falls on the leader's shoulders. And President Biden was a good man. He was not a articulate communicator. And as his administration went on, he had less capacity, I think, to really sort of robustly, energetically make that case to the American people. But if in the magic world we could rewind the tape to January 20th, 2021, that's where I would encourage us to spend more energy, effort, and focus.
Okay. Ryan, I want to be respectful of your time. You've generously given us 30 minutes. Where can our listeners follow your work?
Well, thanks for asking. I work at the Brookings Institution and have a website there. I also am on X and Instagram, and would value engagement on any of those platforms.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again for the time.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Graham.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Tune in next time.